Walter Pincus is a graduate of Yale and Georgetown Law School. For over 30 years, his award-winning work has appeared in the Washington Post. He received the George Polk Award for exposing the neutron warhead, a TV Emmy for his work on a CBS documentary about defense of the United States, the first Stuart Alsop Award for coverage of national security, and in 2002, he was one of 6 Washington Post reporters to win the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. He currently teaches at Stanford University's Washington campus. In October of 2003, Walter co-wrote a story for the Post, which described a July 12, 2003 conversation between an unnamed Bush administration official and an unnamed reporter. The official allegedly said that the wife of Joseph Wilson, an Iraq war critic, worked for the CIA, putting my friend Walter right in the middle of the Valerie Plame issue and investigation. If you read the Post yesterday, you saw a very informative article about the history of nuclear weapons and North Korea, byline, of course, Walter Pincus. I first met Walter in the early 1980s when I was working for then Senator David Pryor. An aging Titan II missile housed in an underground silo in rural Arkansas exploded, sending its nuclear warhead into a ditch where it was undiscovered for hours while the world held its breath. Walter, as you might imagine, was all over that story. I am Skip Rutherford, Dean of the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service, and it is a personal thrill for me to present to you Walter Pincus.
I really know I'm addressing the Ann Terry fan club and her relatives. No, I really appreciate coming down here, and particularly here. Needless to say, I've got 40 years of memories of Little Rock and Arkansas, and to some degree, a lot of what's happened to me, as you'll see, is related to having been lucky enough to work for Senator Fulbright, for which money was not the reward, and was the reward. Senator Fulbright even fixed that up, and it was a domestic rather than a foreign relations problem. I said I'd come down and wanted to talk about what you have listed as the fourth branch of government. But the full title was, which is, you'll find out why I feel this way, it's really what happened to the fourth branch of government. Fourth Branch of Government was a book written in 1959 by Douglas Cater, who's then Washington editor of Reporter magazine. In it, he argued that the press, and at that point, more importantly, television, which was coming into its own as the primary source of most news, were powerful participants in the government process. It wasn't a new idea. Edmund Burke in the 18th century had described 3 estates of the British Parliament and then added, quote, "But in the reporter's gallery yonder, there sat a 4th estate more important than them all. Whoever can speak, speaking now to the whole nation, becomes a power or branch of government with inalienable weight in lawmaking, in all acts of authority." Today's media, and particularly newspapers, shy away from that idea. But the role of the fourth branch, the role of the media, which is specially protected under the First Amendment, is really a requirement of democracy. And these days, it's needed even more than ever, as the presidency has become the dominant originator of news, all but eclipsing the legislative and the judicial branches. James Madison in the Federalist Papers said that what the Founding Fathers fought for was a government in which the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be separate and distinct so that no person should exercise the powers of more than one. Cater's view, and one that I hold, was that the power of the press 50 years ago was being used both to good and bad effects, but without the realization of a role they had to play. He criticized the media then for being manipulated into reporting what officials said without caring or knowing about the underlying facts and the results of what they wrote. Alluding to Senator Joseph McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator who was tagging people as communists, Cater wrote, quote, "It was not intimidation that caused the press to serve as an instrument of McCarthy. It was the inherent vulnerabilities, the frozen patterns of the press, which McCarthy discovered and played on with unerring skill." That was 50 years ago. And at that time, through the book, Cater tried to force journalists and their editors and the managers of those companies to realize that what they did, their decisions, directly affected government, whether they liked it or not. Quote, "The reporter is a recorder of government, but also is a participant. He, or she these days, operates in a system in which power is divided. He, the reporter, as much as anyone, and more than a great many, helps shape the course of government." I agree with that and add that the electronic and print media today probably have more power over public opinion than they did 50 years ago. But the media today turns much of that power, much of their space, much of their airtime over to people who create events just to get coverage. Owners, editors, and reporters rarely push issues they believe the government should take up. I would bet if a vote were taken among editors of the major daily newspapers, the vice presidents of network news divisions, TV and radio anchors, and I hate to say probably even most younger print and electronic reporters, the result would be that none want nor do they believe they have a right to shape government actions. They would claim they just report the news, quote, "objectively," and without intent to influence listeners, viewers, or readers to adopt to their ideas. They don't want to play activist roles in government, either personally or professionally, unless in case of some of them, it helps the bottom line. I believe this failure is a threat to our democracy and a poor example for the rest of the world where we supposedly are spreading the need for a free press. Nobody elected us is one of the themes that have developed in the last decade. And the fact is that's probably a good reason why they should play a major role, because they're supposed to be searching for the truth and not presenting the sides of one or another political force that are looking to govern. Mine, I know, is a romantic and an unfashionable view of journalism these days, but it's the one that caused many of us in my generation take the profession up in the first place. I grew up reading about journalists as a teenager, the life of Lincoln Steffens, the man who wrote Shame of the Cities, and at the turn of the century, the autobiography of William Allen White. Steffens, in a foreword to Shame of the Cities, wrote that his collecting of information about corruption was, quote, "all very unscientific, but then I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist. I did not gather with indifference all the facts, arrange them patiently for permanent preservation and laboratory analysis. My purpose was no more scientific than the spirit of my investigation and reports. It was to see if the shameful facts of corruption, spread out in all their shame, would not burn through our civic shamelessness and set fire to American pride. That was the journalism of it. I wanted to move and to convince." White was an editor and publisher in a small town in the Emporia Gazette in Kansas. His editorials and writings were circulated throughout the nation. And he helped explain and promote Teddy Roosevelt's progressive ideas in the first years of the 20th century. It did not bother his readers that he was at the same time a Republican state committeeman, a personal friend of the President, Roosevelt, and other presidents, promoter, supporter of candidates at the local, state, and national level, even a delegate to the GOP presidential conventions, which he also covered as a reporter for a nationwide newspaper syndicate. He sat in the reporters' gallery and went down on the floor to vote when the Kansas delegation voted. His writings, however, spoke for themselves, and people read them for what they were. People forget the founding editors of the New York Times started that illustrious newspaper as a supporting figure for the Whig Party, later switched to the Republican Party. One of its founders, Henry J. Raymond, was, in the words of Gerald W. Johnson, the author of the biography of Adolph Hawks, quote, as much a politician as an editor, unquote. He was elected to Congress, for a time was chairman of the Republican National Committee while editing the Times. But he had integrity, and when the Republicans turned away from Lincoln's policy of reconciliation in the post-Civil War period, he ended his personal career by turning against the party and used the newspaper to support that point of view. His political career ended, but the Times, according to Johnson, record for, quote, honesty and courage were established beyond a doubt. The great Adolph Hawks, who bought the paper in 1896, used a personal letter from Grover Cleveland to help seal the deal. And Cleveland, who wrote that Hawks, as the manager of his earlier newspaper, the Chattanooga Times, quote, had demonstrated such a faithful adherence to the Democratic Party principles, I'm glad to see him in a larger sphere of usefulness. Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, other newspaper giants at the time were also players in government policy. Washington Post publisher Phil Graham helped put Lyndon Johnson on the ticket with John F. Kennedy. So what? Sure, they used their presses to influence government, but that's what the Founding Fathers contemplated when they wrote the First Amendment. Pamphleteers, newspaper editors, writers of all kind could have their say, and citizens were to weigh all the facts, all the opinions as presented, and make up their own minds. Today, mainstream print, electronic media want to be neutral, unbiased, objective, presenting both or all sides as if they were refereeing a game, and the players, the government and its opponents, are the only ones who participate. They have increasingly become, the media, common carriers, transmitters of other people's ideas and thoughts, irrespective of import, relevance, and at even times accuracy. We're in the midst of an important congressional election for all members of the House and 1/3 of the Senate. For the most part, the candidates and their parties set the agenda. When is the last time you saw a major newspaper, magazine, or television network set out its own agenda, and particularly newspapers, for the candidates to take up? At a time when it's most needed, the media has dropped the idea of doing such things. And they also have less experienced reporters providing analysis and context, turning instead on controversial issues to so-called experts or retired public figures. The expertise, which is another one of my main themes, is something that's no longer a goal of everyone. It wasn't always this way. As a copy boy in 1954, fresh out of college, I was on the editorial page of the New York Times as a copy boy, delivering mail and punching in the newspapers every morning for a man named Hanson Baldwin, who was then the paper's highly respected military correspondent. When Baldwin wrote a news story or a piece of analysis, it was read by the Pentagon, other officials, people in Congress. They had to read him because his years of coverage and his perceptive views made him an expert, almost as expert as top generals, and probably more than most civilian defense officials who rotated in and out of government. From the 50s, the 60s, at least through the 80s, I could name reporters and columnists whose experience on their beats or in their areas made them thoughtful and respected commentators. Only 3 reporters held the position of diplomatic correspondent of the Washington Post during 30 years from the 60s to the 1990s. Chalmers Roberts, Murray Martyr, Don Oberdorfer. And readers interested in foreign policy, including those people in the State Department and in the Congress, eagerly sought out their byline stories. In the 11 years since Don has left, we've had 5 and maybe 6 diplomatic correspondents at the Post. Younger reporters today are shifted around from beat to beat, never really having enough time to master totally the complex subjects such as health, environmental policies. Stories are written based on the initiative of government sources or critics of the government, and ironically not by the press or the media itself. Starting sometime in the Nixon administration, probably with Vice President Spiro Agnew's attacks on the liberal press, and ironically at about the same time Watergate was such a success, newspapers began pulling back from initiating enterprise reporting on controversial national affairs. They began to worry more about critics who, for their own either biased or political reasons, disagreed with what they read. The electronic media, because of government licensing, had what's called a fairness doctrine, requiring presentation of opposing views on controversial issues. It deterred television networks from taking the initiative to present such issues. Another development had its impact, particularly on the print media, but also electronic. Ownership began to change. America's newspapers, which began for the most part as family and privately owned enterprise by businessmen or people who were interested in government in their own areas and towns, started newspapers. And they offered competitive news, different opinions, local, national government, city issues across the country. But beginning in the 1960s, papers, large and small, started being swallowed up by corporations. A few remained privately owned, but almost even they all went public. With monopoly ownership came one newspaper, cities and towns, and the notion that the publications that survive should be neutral, presenting all points of view in each controversial story. Ironically, the fairness doctrine, which had begun with radio and television, has been transferred now to print and the newspaper. And how ironic it is, because there are now dozens of competing electronic voices in every city, most of which now have only one newspaper. Fox, with its open bias toward conservative anchors and talk shows, has gained popularity over CNN, which seeks to be neutral, partly because I believe people want opinions. They want to hear something they either agree or disagree with. The Graham and Sulzberger's family, owners of the Post and the New York Times, are one major reason why these newspapers continue to provide quality journalism, continue to provide money for us to do the kind of journalism that I'm allowed to do and a lot of people on the Times and the Post are. But even the Times and the Post and their editors are sensitive when accused today of showing favoritism or antipathy toward one political party or another, or to whomever occupies the White House. They react even when such claims are obviously done as harassment or for public relations reasons. The need to appear objective is passed down through the ranks. Some standards are obvious. No staff member gives campaign contribution, marching in demonstration in hot-button issues, speaks publicly on behalf of candidates, takes trips by foreign governments. Those are obvious. But other steps are creating unusual ripples. The executive editor and editorial page editor of my newspaper, the Washington Post, do not vote in elections to preserve the appearance of neutrality. Luckily, they don't demand it of the rest of us. Recently, the public editor of the New York Times took to task Linda Greenhouse, who is really the most distinguished Supreme Court correspondent of our time. His complaint, she had spoken before 800 people at Harvard, where she had received the Radcliffe Institute Medal, and gave what he considered her personal opinions about issues of the day. She said government, quote, had turned its energy and attention away from upholding the rule of law and toward creating law-free zones at Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and Haditha. The Supreme Court had said, in effect, the same thing. She also added, let's not forget the sustained assault on women's reproductive freedom, the hijacking of public policy by religious fundamentalism. Ms. Greenhouse told the public editor she considered her remarks to be statements of fact and not opinion. He raised the questions of whether she had violated a Times ethical code against expressing personal opinions in public, and whether allowing her to cover the Supreme Court cases that involve topics she mentioned, quote, risks giving the paper's critics fresh opportunities to snipe at its public policy coverage. Not an issue of whether it was accurate or not, just somehow they could complain about something. He went on to say the Times editors appeared willing to take that risk, thank God, and said his predecessor as public editor had also said that her published coverage showed her own strong opinions don't affect her journalism. That's what we all should be measured by what appears in our paper and not what we say elsewhere. I certainly hope that as witnesses to public events these past decades, we've all developed strong opinion which at times we may privately act upon, or else we're just not human. You can't watch what's going on today or in the past and not have personal opinions if you're the people right on the scene. After 50 years of living and working in Washington, many reporters, including myself, have personal friends in Congress, on federal court benches, in high government positions, even in the White House. I was lucky enough to work for Senator Fulbright twice in the 60s, running these investigations for him. It was the most important learning years of my life, and ever since I've influenced the reporting I do on government. The story about North Korea had its roots way back in a 1969 trip I took to South Korea. They also provided me with a wondrous Arkansas wife, a flood of friends who are all here, and some of whom I occasionally write about. I'm a Democrat, everybody knows it, nobody is more aware of it than I am each time I write a story for the Post. I'm more aware of it, and of course so are the Republicans. More and more, however, reporters and editors in Washington Post elsewhere avoid socializing, developing friendships with public officials, feel they have to drop friends who move into such position. One result is public figures become one-dimensional to reporters. They have no wives, they have no children, they have no husbands, they have no personal lives, they have no real feelings. The distance from reality has led to another development of our time. Walter Lippmann pointed out in Public Opinion, a book he wrote 80 years ago, quote, the enormous discretion as to what facts and what impressions shall be reported is steadily convincing every organized group of people that whether it wishes to secure publicity or avoid it, the exercise of discretion cannot be left to the reporter. It's safer to hire a press agent. Tony Lewis, a great New York Times reporter and a friend, used a July 1960 speech to a Harvard Law Review audience to raise questions about objectivity, public relations that are now issues today. And speaking about the coverage of that same Senator McCarthy, he noted the Associated Press, a matter of high-level policy, kept all interpretation out of its stories about the senator. Stories were supposed to be objective, factual, deadpan presentation of the senator's activities. But as McCarthy's charges grew more shrill with his power, Lewis and some of the AP reporters and editors began realizing that objectivity may be a little more complicated. Quote, was it objective to report a speech by Senator McCarthy without pointing out his own internal contradictions? Was it objective to report his account of the spies he had uncovered at closed session of his committee hearings without checking others who had been in the hearing and had seen no spies unveiled? The result was a recognition of a need for interpretive reporting. Quote, the idea of reporters exercising judgment worries many editors, just as some judges prefer to find absolute commands in the text of statutes and constitutions because they say it's inappropriate for judges to weigh these things in the balance. Lewis, who covered the court, quote, I'm not going to get into the judges' disagreement, but it seems to me there is no way for newspapermen to escape making judgments. Earlier this year, I wrote an article for the Neiman Reports on the subject of courage in journalism. They focus mainly people talking about their experiences in war zones like Iraq or from totalitarian country where reporters' lives or safety are at issue. They asked me to write about Washington, and it's a far less dramatic form of courage if a journalist stands up in front of a government official and politician who he or she has reason to believe is not telling the truth or living up to his or her responsibilities. But I wrote, I believe a new kind of courage is needed in this age of instant news, instant analysis, and therefore instant opinion. It all happens to be a time of government by public relations and news stories based on prepared events, prepared texts, prepared responses, all of which are designed to get stories across and may not be what's happening. This is a time for reporters and editors, whether from mainstream media, blogosphere, anywhere, to pause before responding to the latest bulletin, prepared event, most recent statement or background, or whether from the White House, the Democratic or Republican leadership on Capitol Hill. There's too much today being offered to the media about government that can be fit into print or broadcast on a night show. The disturbing trend is that more and more of these informational offerings are nothing but PR, peddled as news. The beginning of the Reagan administration, Mike Deaver, who's one of the great PR men of our time, began using an early morning text session at the White House as something more than a notice to television producers as to where the president would appear that day. He turned the meeting into a shaping of the news for that evening. He would roughly say, for example, President Reagan will appear in the Rose Garden and talk about crime and what they're doing about crime and talk about it in terms of Chicago and San Francisco. That would allow the networks to shoot what we call B-roll matter in those two cities so that there'd be a picture other than the president speaking when it ran that evening on the news. The president would appear, make a statement, perhaps take a question or two, and vanish. After a while, the network White House correspondents started attending the early meeting text sessions. Even later, reporters from print did. On days when there was nothing prepared, the president went off to Camp David or California, his ranch. ABC News White House correspondent Sam Donaldson began shouting his famous questions, and those flip answers became the nightly news. And not just in television. The Washington Post, which had never before had a daily slug for a president's story, began to do the same thing. At the end of Reagan's first year, David Broder, our Post distinguished political reporter, wrote a column about Reagan being among the least involved presidents he had ever covered. The result was he received an onslaught of mail from people who said repeatedly they had seen him every night on TV working. It couldn't be. When President George H.W. Bush succeeded Reagan and occasionally drifted off the appointed subject, criticism began to appear that he, quote, couldn't stay on message. Bill Clinton arrived, and as president, as you all know better did 2, 3, 4, 5 things a day. Some critics went after him for, quote, mixing up the message. The truth of the matter is that some journalists now write that being able to stay on message is considered a presidential asset. In fact, it may be a requirement for a president. Of course, the, quote, message is the public relations spin that the White House wants to present and may have absolutely nothing to do with what the president did that day or what was going on really in the White House. The system, I used an example of one of the high points recently, when the White House started to give exclusive background stories that found their way on page 1 either of the Times or the Post. We alternated, in which the readers learned that the president the following week or 10 days was going to give a series of speeches supporting his Iraq policy because his polls were down. Lo and behold, the next week, the same news outlets and almost everyone else carried a story about each of the 4 speeches in which Bush essentially repeated what he'd been saying for the last 2 years. Journalistic courage should include the decision not to publish in a newspaper or carry on TV or radio shows statements made by the president or any other government official designed solely as a public relations tool, offering no new or valuable information. This is far from the concept of the media being the 4th branch of government, but that's where we are. Today, we journalists, however, are not the only ones not doing the job, and particularly of oversight. Congress, the 1st branch, has disregarded oversight and become what the Founding Fathers feared, an effective arm of the executive branch, and our government is the weaker for it. But an election, probably one next month, could change that, could see a Congress, at least one House, returning to its congressional role. My problem is I don't see what will bring back an aggressive, self-confident media other than new owners, editors, reporters who see their newspaper, magazine, or radio, television property as more than just a way to make money and instead a way to make waves. Thank you. I guess questions. I don't know how long.
We have time for quite a few questions, so if you'll just please raise your hand, stand up. The acoustics are pretty bad in here, so please stand up and pronounce your question. So any questions? Go ahead, Heather.
Sorry, I'm Heather Wexler, and I normally don't ask questions. I just want to hear everybody else's, but I'm the architect of practice that I can't resist. What advice would you have for young reporters to have, specifically to get that kind of authority, so they have critical interpretation?
I always hate giving advice to people in the press. I have been so lucky in my career that I have a unique situation. I was lucky enough to get a background by working the way I did it. I wrote for 3 North Carolina papers when I was a kid in Washington. And then I ended up with a great newspaper to work for and a great family in the Grahams, and they have allowed me to do what I do. The basic thing is you really have to do it on your own. The weakness of the press, which always gets me in trouble, is most editors don't believe in themselves enough to take chances. They want somebody else to do it. I got ahead in part because Reporter magazine published stories that I wrote. And then newspapers read them and something happened. To me, you have to initially do it on your own until you're given the freedom. One of the problems I see with what's become professionalized at our paper and elsewhere is they have, quote, investigative units. But investigative units are doing much more in sociology than they are in straight government. We used to do And everybody did it. We truth squatted public officials when they made speeches. And I still remember Reagan used to make so many mistakes that after about 2 months of that, the public kept saying, you know, leave this poor guy alone. It's hard, but you have to keep trying. I mean, I teach this course on oversight of government and the media. I used to teach at Yale, now I teach at Stanford. And part of it is to get people who care about government to go into government service, to go into newspaper business, to see it for what it really historically is. And it's not all parts of it. The newspaper is like a department store. I mean, you've got sports and you have entertainment and you've got all these other things. So the hard news is a separate place. But my view, and it's off where you started, is that newspapers now are supplemental to hard news. And so it's our role to tell people why something happened, put it in some kind of context, or bring to them something brand new that's important in the hard news sense, not just entertaining. But it is this feeling that you don't have a lot of editors who see their role as affecting government policy. And you have to be lucky enough to find people who allow you to do that. And generally, you have to do it on your own first. I mean, the biggest story I ever had when I was writing for North Carolina papers was about congressmen cheating on their expense accounts. And I wrote it in these 3 papers for about a month or 2 because I had all sorts of records. And nothing happened. Next year, I joined up with Don Oberdorfer, who was then working for the Charlotte paper, and we put together a long piece based on all these records. I mean, congressmen, nothing really changes in life. Congressmen were taking trips with their wives, and on the bill, they'd cross the wife's name off and get the whole bill paid, or they'd write food next to bar bills. In those days, you could get access to, they just pasted it in a book, and you could see it if you looked into the records. We put together this long piece, and we didn't know where to go with it, and so we went to I.F. Stone, who was a classic figure and a bomb thrower in his younger days. And he said, because he was always interested in money, besides being a bomb thrower, he said, take it to Life magazine, which in those days was the biggest thing going. So the 2 of us took a bus up to New York. Don had known a young guy had become a deputy assistant managing editor. We walked in, handed the guy the story. He took it, and then he left, and he came back. We were up in some tower in the Time Life building. And he came back with the managing editor of Life. And he said, you know, we want to take a look at this, we're interested. So he then took, the managing editor took us out, Ralph Graves took us out to lunch at some French restaurant, got us drinking wine and all this stuff, about 2 hours, came back. We were sitting there, sort of half sloshed, and they came back and said, we've been trying to get a story about Congress like this, and we've had reporters doing it. They have nothing in their approach to this. We want to buy it. And he offered us each more than we made a whole year for what we were doing. And so we agreed. And then he wanted to give us a car, take us out to the airport. And we said, no, we wanted to walk because we had come by bus. And we didn't have enough to pay for an airplane. And when Don at that point worked for the night papers, the Charlotte Observer, and when the night papers found out that Life was buying it, they said, what are you holding out on us for and all this? So we had to write a series to go into the night newspapers because Life magazine had taken up something. They knew what Don was doing, and they know I had written it the year before. But when Life magazine took it and made it a big issue, they then suddenly saw this was something. It sort of made my career, it made Don's career. But we had essentially done it on our own and gotten a big magazine to say it was important, and then it became important for everybody. The reforms led to the closing of the record, so you know less now. It also taught me that you can reform things and make them worse.
Question.
Some of us didn't get to read your Washington Post story about North Korea, non-weapons. Could you give us a little history or maybe a little more?
I learned a long time ago, you stay within the four walls of what you write. No, it essentially was a story that did two things. One is, because everybody is saying whose fault this is, I wanted to make clear that A, what's going on today has a history that goes back to the 1950s. That Harry Truman threatened the North Koreans with nuclear weapons, that Dwight Eisenhower threatened them with nuclear weapons, and that we put them in to South Korea beginning in '57. And although the public here didn't know about it, the North Koreans knew about it, the Russians knew about it, the Chinese knew about it. And that's when the Russians gave the North Koreans, back in 1960, their first test reactor and the beginnings of what is developed into their program. And over the years, we have occasionally threatened them again. So that it's rooted in that. And then the Clinton administration faced a crisis because they had begun to take plutonium out of the reactor they had. And so they worked out a bilateral agreement which eliminated and froze the plutonium process, but the North Koreans went around it by beginning to develop enriched uranium because this drive for nuclear weapons, which is a whole other thing of mine, is something you can't stop. And you have to learn to live with it. Nuclear weapons have not done anybody any good since World War II. It ended World War II, and it kept us from having a world war with the Russians. The Israelis have had nuclear weapons for, 20 years, and they still get shot up all the time. And nuclear weapons in the hands of the Israelis became a trigger for the Iranians and the Iraqis to have nuclear weapons, but nobody likes to mention the Israeli nuclear weapons, so it becomes irrational. Why do the Iraqis want weapons? So we tend to block out things that we don't want to hear. And so I just wanted to make it clear publicly that there was a long history of this. And if you go back to the origins of it, to some degree, as we are with a lot of things, it's terrible to say, we help push whatever it is becomes our nemesis. But you have to deal with the North Koreans one-on-one. There is no other way to do it. Our solution, which is to tighten sanctions, which only can be done with the help of the Chinese and the South Koreans, is not an answer for the Chinese, because if you break North Korea, they're going to face an onslaught of refugees, which creates a problem for them. I was telling the students earlier, one of the other great lessons of Senator Fulbright is that if you, he used to give you these lessons, but they all made sense. He said, if you don't understand the domestic problems facing a foreign country you're dealing with, you cannot deal with them. The issues that may be good for you may be bad for them. And so you have to understand what the issues are with whether it's an ally or an enemy, what his domestic issues are before you deal with foreign policy issues that affect both of you. Just because it helps you, it may not help them at all, and therefore they're not going to cooperate. So you got to work it out in between. It is not, no one country can force another country to do things it doesn't want to do, except militarily, and that is the most short-sighted view anybody can ever have in foreign policy. Yeah.
Are we making a mistake relying on six-party talks? Should we be negotiating bilaterally with North Korea?
I don't know the details at all, but I'm sure we should. I don't see the advantage in not negotiating with anybody. What do you lose? North Korea is not going to rise up and be a great country tomorrow just because you don't want to talk to them, or you do want to talk to them. They've got us over a barrel. So you deal with them.
I have found from talking to my own kids is that they don't read newspapers. And it seems to me that that's a problem that people like you and me ought to be worried about. And I think the reason for that is that school now is rather different from what it used to be. I went to school over in North Little Rock, Arkansas, and every one of the teachers every year brought in the daily newspapers, and they made us read them, and they gave us tests. And that's not going on in the schools today, at least not in this part of the country. And the reason for that is these young, bright teachers that we have, they didn't read newspapers either. And it seems to me that the industry, and I don't know what the industry can do, but it seems to me that somebody ought to do something.
One of the many failures of my career path was that back in '70, after I did the second Fulbright thing, I tried to start a national newspaper. And I had a theory because the monopoly situation was beginning, and if you didn't realize it at the time, and it's even greater now, what's grown up are these enormous cities around major universities. Champaign-Urbana, Lansing, you could name dozens of them. And so they all had one newspaper. There were one newspaper towns, and most of them, the newspaper in that town was a monopoly-owned chain. Gannett was beginning to buy papers and drain them and all the rest of it. And so I thought, God, you know, there are 400 or 500,000 people in Champaign-Urbana. You know, if you can't sell 20,000 good 26, 32-page tabloid national foreign news newspaper, there's no place. So we did the survey around the country. And in 1971, 2, 3, college students and university professors didn't read newspapers. I'm half owned by the Post Corporation, so I work on a lot of these figures. And regular newspaper readership began when couples generally had their first child and lived in a home. My argument about what's happening is, yeah, we are not the first carriers of hard news. And the paper delivers a lot of other things besides hard news that you can't get. So we ought to play that role. What I think's happened, and it's a losing battle in my own paper, is that we have produced newspapers to please us. How many times, I don't know what you do down here, but we even have the Times doing this, printing these enormous takeouts on subjects, some of which are important, some of which are esoteric. A lot of them win prizes. I mean, I always use my own newspaper. I probably shouldn't. You know, Len Downey, the editor of the Washington Post, has won more Pulitzer Prizes with this latest award session than Ben Bradley. But the paper is nowhere near as aggressive and as I think, hard-hitting as it used to be. Part of it is because, and we lose readership. We have surveys that show people don't read these things. Judges read them and give us prizes. One of our Pulitzer Prize stories this past year hardly had any readership at all and no impact, but it was beautifully written. And we can't find how many people ever read it. That's not why you put out a newspaper. You put out a newspaper to both meet your needs of what I consider constitutional responsibility and also to meet the needs of your readers. And I think one thing that's happened with newspapers is they've forgotten about their readers and they've thought more about themselves and print it for themselves. When's the last time there was sort of a big major event? This is always my favorite with the paper. A huge event I mean, this wasn't a big enough Katrina or whatever, and you pick up the Post, the Times, any big newspaper, and maybe your own, and there are 5 or 6 or 7 stories on the same thing. No reader in their right mind is going to read those stories. But every editor wants to have a piece of it. Every reporter wants to have a piece of it. And so we print 4, 5, 6 stories on a single subject in one day. Readers have, it used to have 18, when I did the survey, there was 18 to 25 minutes, the average reader for a newspaper. Now it's average around 20. You can't, that is not a paper, particularly these big events, because most people who care about them watch them on television. So you're just filling up space with things people don't want to read. And so you have to become more aggressive, and you have to become more involved in what's going on. But also you've got to do the services part better than we tend to do them. And I think you've got to create experts. I mean, to me, there are subjects like medicine, healthcare, environment, all these things that have local implications that we, I don't know what your situation is here, but we rotate people around. Our new health reporter was doing something on the federal page a year ago. His predecessor did it for 2 years, and before that she was a political writer. Well, you keep rotating people around. They're totally dependent on the people who put out the news. And they don't have enough time to do anything of their own because they're not there long enough. So that's another reason why I think it's dropping off.
Yes, sir, in the back. One second, sir. In the back.
Possibly, like Bob before, I started as a copy boy, worked my way up, and taught. The University of Arkansas at Little Rock campus newspaper is filled with wire news and national news. And the advisor tells me, because he can't get students who want to be reporters, they all expect to graduate, walk into a television station, become anchormen. And so what's the future of newspapers?
I guess prayer. No, I think you try, I don't know. To me, it's by example. A couple of my kids from Yale and 2 or 3 or 4 of the Stanford kids are either in journalism or in government out of, I don't know, maybe 60. That's not bad. But it's a tough profession now to break into, partly because of the consolidation. No, the death of the family-owned, business owner newspaper was a real tragedy.
Yes, sir.
I think I have this right. If I remember, one of our nation's most respected newspapers has knowledge of the location of the so-called secret CIA prisons in other countries, but has chosen not to disclose that publicly in their reporting. And I'm just wondering what you think about that decision.
It wasn't my story, but I know the story behind it. And it's one of those decisions that we make. We publish part of the story and not the whole story. And they convinced both the reporter and the editors involved that it would cause a real problem. The countries came out, I think, subsequent to that. And it's one of these evolutions of government, you make those decisions. They took a beating for a while about just writing a story in the first place. And it's also, one of the ironies of that story is the New York Times had a front page story a year before that had every one of the facts, including that they were being held in different places around the world, but didn't call them black prisons. And the story dropped like a stone. So a lot of what happens in journalism is kind of a fluke. And so, I mean, we don't tell everything. And in that case, we told part of it. I don't think it hurt the story.
I'm sure it has occurred to you that if the story were told, then it might put pressure on the nations that perhaps have permitted the secret prisons, and so then the secret prisons would come to a halt because there would be too much pressure to maintain them. And
Well,
so it isn't the decision of the newspaper perhaps helping to facilitate the perpetuation of those prisons.
I guess you could argue that. The names came out within 2 days, and I don't think it made too much of a difference. I don't know the stories in what was it, Poland, Romania, somewhere. I don't know the impact it had. A lot of these decisions are made. I'm sure if they wanted to start a secret, hold somebody secretly somewhere, they could still do it. What's interesting about it is they then when it became politically interesting, they transferred them to Guantanamo.
Hi, I'm one of the students in the school here, and I have a question. I'm trying to reconcile 2 points that you've made. On the one hand, you seem to lament the fact that the media is trying to be too neutral. But on the other hand, you've mentioned a couple of times about consolidation. The FCC is loosening the regulations and allowing more and more consolidation of the print and TV and the radio media by one person or one corporation. So how do I think about fewer and fewer people are owning the media, but you don't want them to be neutral? I'm just afraid that one corporation is going to have the power to set the agenda, to have the initiative of what kind of news gets out there, what kind of events get reported.
Well, I think it depends on who owns them. I shock all my friends. I think Rupert Murdoch runs his papers the way they ought to be run. I mean, they do what he wants done. They take his positions and all the rest of it. And when it comes to Fox, it's quite popular. What bothers me is everybody else wants to make believe they're neutral without realizing there is a hunger for that kind of opinion. They're just afraid to do it because they don't take the criticism. Roger Ailes, who runs Fox, is an amazing character. I mean, I've dealt with him. And he enjoys fighting. He enjoys combat. And that's what results. It's too bad that people on the other side aren't as feisty as he is. But I think that's one purpose for owning these things.
One more question. One more.
Well, we are a one-paper town, or a family-owned newspaper, and I don't feel like I'm getting good news. I mean, it's a very slanted position. It doesn't have to be mine. So why is that okay? With the Post when it isn't, I don't think, okay with me.
Well, I think, this goes on all over the place. And the answer is you and your friends and everybody else get together and buy a newspaper. And no, it sounds, it's easier one of the things that's gone on in this business is offset press makes it much easier and much cheaper. Produce, I don't know your situation here, weeklies are now popping up all over the place because there's so much downtime all over. The Arkansas Times does it. Get some powerhouse to buy that and make it 3 or 4 or 5 times a week and have advertisers do it and you're in business. But that's sort of the democratic, it's not to lecture you people, but democracy requires people to do things. It requires them to vote. Everybody's upset. Nobody wants campaign financing. Isn't it terrible? But nobody gives. The public at large wouldn't give a nickel. They don't even check off on their tax return. And it's not even their money. The irony is the press is to blame for a lot of that. But in a democracy, you have to do these things. You have to get out and vote. You have to run for office. You got to support candidates. You got to help. It takes work. And I think most of us have gotten sort of fat and just want to let it go. And so the people who take advantage of it, lobbyists who are bad lobbyists is against good lobbyists, business, corporation, all the rest of it. They get involved because they have an interest. Well, everybody's got an interest, but everybody doesn't want to play. And to make democracy work, you have to.
For those who weren't able to answer the questions, I'm sure you could visit with Walter a little bit afterwards. But let's thank Walter once more time for visiting with us.